welcome to the Human Being Human. This is the Human Being Human, and this is the Human Being Human podcast. This is the Human Being Human pod to the Human Being Human podcast. This is the Human Being Human podcast.
There are fiction writers who would have us believe that just 3 types of people inhabit small Midwestern towns. There are those who are discontented, wanting to get away. There are those who are too dumb to know enough to want to get away. And the rest are half-wits. Not qualifying for the first section, I must belong somewhere down the line. Our town is small. In fact, to speak of our town at all is rank hyperbole, for it is not even a town, but is incorporated as a village. It is so small that, with the exception of Maine, the streets are not called by their names, and you have to look on a map or an abstract to find out what they are. We glibly say, over by Clements and down by the high school, and in the last few years have been putting on airs by saying, across the park instead of the meadow. Tell me why you continue to live in a small town, wrote the editor. The question makes me stop and wonder. Perhaps it's inertia, just small town stagnation. But I do not think so. Nebraska Hall of Fame writer Bess Streeter Aldridge, from her 1933 essay, Why I Live in a Small Town. On March 1st, 1867, the territory of Nebraska, then governed by Alvin Saunders, officially joined the Union of the United States as the 37th state, just behind Nevada and ahead of Colorado. It was only a short time before copious amounts of towns and counties began sprouting, budding, and cropping up across the Cornhusker state. Some would grow large enough to become thriving cities and urban centers, but not many, and eventually 9 out of every 10 communities in Nebraska would have populations of 3,000 folks or less. But come every fall Saturday, time and space are transcended, and nearly every human being in the state, no matter how big or small of a town they live in, will be tuning into one thing, and one thing only. The University of Nebraska Cornhusker Marching Band, the pride of all Nebraska. What can I say about the experience of growing up in small-town America that hasn't already been written about 1,000 times over? Honestly, not much, and I believe that's the entire point. These are common, everyday, ordinary familiarities that all human beings can relate to and share and understand in an almost unspoken and unwritten way. Of course, this isn't a uniquely American phenomenon, and the immigrants that arrived in 19th century Nebraska brought these same familiar values with them from their countryside villages abroad. If history does indeed rhyme, then small-town rural life is an aspect of human experience that I think bears repeating. I cycle through thoughts about my friends and my family and my hometown regularly, almost like a record on repeat. I think about times when our friends and I rode bikes and skateboards around town when we were in elementary school, when we played night tag during junior high summers, and when we rode around back gravel roads when we were old enough to drive, or sometimes not. The cliché that small-town folks don't lock their doors at night hits particularly close to home for myself. When my grandparents sold their farm in 2007, the farm I grew up running around as a youngster, they didn't even own a key to the front door to give to the new owners. Extraordinary. Like all of our hometowns and the places we grew up in, my home is extraordinarily ordinary. My hometown just happens to be extraordinarily ordinary.
Nothing's wrong in my world today. Nothing's wrong, oh yeah. Nothing's wrong in my world today. Nothing's wrong, oh yeah. Nothing's wrong in my world today. Nothing's wrong, oh yeah. Nothing's wrong in my world today.
Welcome to the Human Being Human podcast. I'm your host and creator, Carrington Cooper. If you made it to this point and decided that this podcast isn't for you, thanks for your endurance and perseverance so far. If you've been keeping notes, you'll know that this podcast has taken us through a variety of paleos and ologies, from paleontology and paleogeography to archaeology and anthropology. During the previous episode, we watched as the New World and Old World collided for the first time in our human being human story. As the dust and debris settled, so did the folks in my own family, as they staked their claims on the Great Plains of Nebraska and plowed their way into the history books. My family in my hometown, just like yours and everybody else's, is extraordinarily ordinary, as it should be, and hopefully in all the best ways. In today's episode, I'd like to share the history of my own, the town of Ord, in Valley County, Nebraska. In American mythology, homesteaders and settlers are often viewed as fiercely independent, ruggedly individualistic, and as manifestors of their own destinies, far away from the overruling eyes of the man. While there is partial truth to this, the history of how Nebraska came to be a land of farms and ranches is much more nuanced, as is usually the case. When I first sat down and began researching my hometown of Ord, Nebraska, I didn't anticipate that it would flower into a full podcast series. I was pleasantly surprised at the wealth of information that was available in my little local ecosystem, and all for free and readily available for public access. Truthfully, an entire podcast series on Valley County itself could be done. The amount of biography, archives, and other historical documents is quite extensive. Of course, my connection to this small place in the center of the U.S. has personal and emotional significance to who I am as a human being, so it's easy to get caught up in the mountains of memories and nostalgia. I have to keep in mind, though, not everybody listening shares these first-hand experiences, so I can't take for granted any potential interests listeners may or may not have. Would I want to listen to a podcast about Whitfield, Indiana, or Wellsburg, North Dakota, or any town in Iowa? Some answers are obvious, but I'll try my best to articulate why my home is extraordinarily ordinary. In this episode, it is my intention to highlight and emphasize the absolutely pivotal role that the United States federal government played in creating my state, my county, and my hometown. As budding townships cropped up on the plains of Nebraska, it would be public institutions from distant lands, aka the man, that would allow them to settle and establish themselves in their new homes. To speak plainly, God may have made a farmer, but it was the United States federal government that made the farms. We're going to examine 3 key facets to the foundations of my home Ord, Nebraska. Congressional legislation, economic stimulus, and military intervention. We've already discussed military intervention in the previous episode, in our examination of the numerous forts that were constructed on the Great Plains. Just 11 miles up the road from Ord, Nebraska, stands Fort Hartsuff, one of the most well-preserved 19th century forts that currently exists in the United States. Fort Hartsuff played a pivotal role in the formation of the town I graduated high school from, and it was the many elementary school trips to this outpost that would leave a huge impression on my young mind. Strap in and buckle up, folks, because today we're going to look at the exciting world of local government. On the macro level, the federal government cleared the path for early settlements by forcibly removing the natives with military intervention, gifting free land for farming and ranching to settlers, and investing in the railroads and businesses that would connect and support these budding communities. Once all of the big pieces were in place, it was up to the individual men, women, and children to join and assemble it all together and organize themselves into working and thriving villages and townships. Not only did these localities require farms and ranches, but they also needed general stores and post offices, lumber and flour mills, schools and newspapers, hotels, and city halls. It was here on the Great Plains of Nebraska and the lush Loup River Valley where preparation came head-on, face-to-face, hand-in-hand, toe-to-toe, arm-in-arm, with opportunity. We're going to discuss a crucial piece of congressional legislation that laid the foundations, literally, for my home of Valley County, Nebraska, the Homestead Act of 1862, which some listeners have likely heard of. The Homestead Act allowed any adult citizen or immigrant intending to attain citizenship to claim up to 160 acres of surveyed government land. Claimants were required to make improvements to the plot by constructing buildings, such as houses and barns, and plowing and cultivating the land. After 5 years of working on the claim, the original filer was entitled to the entire property at zero cost, except for a small registration fee. Free stuff, as it's called by the kids today. Abraham Lincoln signed the Homestead Act into law on May 20th, 1862. And so, the free stuff craze was officially on, and homesteaders rushed to the Midwest to stake their claims. Some settlers started sooner than others, who thought it would be okay to cheat and make their claims before the official starting bell. Individual homesteaders weren't the only folks getting in on the free stuff craze in the mid-1800s. At the same time settlers were getting free land from the government, large tracts of land were granted to railroads and other private companies by both the state and the federal government. In turn, these companies and individuals sold and invested these assets into the various settlements and communities on the Great Plains. This provided huge economic stimulus to budding townships and allowed ranchers and farmers to bring their products to faraway markets. Most of the earliest localities that sprouted up in Nebraska did so by massive federal spending in both the private and public sectors. All in all, 16% of Nebraska's total land area was given away to 11 major railroads by the government. These included Union Pacific Railroad, as well as the Burlington and Missouri River Railroad, which was involved in the foundation of Ord, Nebraska. These are the railroads that brought great economic stimulus to the Loup River Valley. It was Ronald Reagan who I think put it best. The 9 most comforting words in the English language are, "I'm from the government, and I'm here to help." In the year 1871, the first claims in the Loup River Valley that would become Valley County, Nebraska, were officially signed, sealed, and delivered. Let's set the extraordinarily ordinary scene of where these earliest Ordites settled down and attempted to create a new life for themselves. Only a handful of tributaries flow from the east side of the North Loup River, but on the west there are quite a few, including the Turtle, Dane, Myra, Bean, Haskell, and Davis Creeks, to name just a few. The very first settlement in what would become Valley County was established in April of 1872. This is when Peter Mortensen, Nels Anderson, George Miller, Jeppe Smith, and Fall Miller, a small party of Danish immigrants from Wisconsin, settled on the west side of the North Loup River, about 2 miles north of the present-day city of Ord. The area they occupied would later be known as Dane Creek, as mentioned above. Earlier that year, after initially traveling through the valley, this Danish group had considered settling in the southern part of the county, near the present town of North Loup. However, upon arrival, the Danes learned that this location had already been claimed by a colony of Seventh-day Baptists, who would arrive only a few days later from Wisconsin as well. And so the Danes settled on what would become Dane Creek, becoming the first European pioneers to live in my home of Valley County, Nebraska. During the previous spring, in 1871, Reverend Oscar Babcock of Washura County, Wisconsin, organized his congregation of Seventh-day Baptists into a homesteading colony. A scouting committee was formed, and it set out to explore a potential new home for themselves on the American frontier. Like many of those traveling west, these homesteaders were seeking the good life, wanting no more than to take care of their families and practice their religion in peace. After their scouting party examined and explored the Loup River Valley, Reverend Babcock moved his congregation to the broad and fertile bottomlands along the North Loup River, in the eastern part of what is now Valley County. In May of 1872, 15 families arrived near present-day North Loup, Nebraska. In the fall of the same year, more than 20 more families joined the Seventh-day Baptist settlement. It wasn't long before new roots would be planted in these pioneers' expanding communities. Reverend Oscar Babcock, Valley County's first preacher, married the very first couple in the county. Nels Anderson, one of the original Danish settlers, married a woman named Hannah Mortensen. The wedding ceremony took place near the settlement of North Loup, inside a cedar log house with a dirt floor, on July 6, 1872. It was only a few months later when more and more families and settlers migrated to the Loup River Valley, and these two budding settlements continued to grow and plow ahead. The first houses that were built were sod dugouts, until more sturdy framed houses made out of brick, lime, and wood could be constructed later to help weather the relentless Nebraska climate. Other claims in the valley would soon be filed, and small townships began to crop up across the lush region. There was a real buzz in the air, both from the new settlers moving into the region, but mostly from the abundance of flies and mosquitoes that inhabited the wet river valley. As more and more families moved in and started homesteading in the region, businesses, services, and other critical infrastructure began to pop up in the valley as well. In 1872, the nearest post office on the North Loup River was at the settlement of Coatesfield, over 30 miles away. That year, a route was extended up the valley on both sides of the North Loup River to Valley County. Later that fall, a post office near the North Loop settlement was established, and Reverend Oscar Babcock, the pastor and leader of the colony, was appointed postmaster. In the winter of 2012, myself and 3 friends walked from Coatesville to Ord in a 12-hour, 30-mile overnight adventure. Although we felt like we were all going postal by the end of the trek, my friends and I had no idea at the time that we were walking the first mail routes of our postal forefathers. Oscar Babcock himself carried the mail to Ord, and for a brief time, Mrs. S.S. Haskell managed the route from Ord to the settlement of Burwell in neighboring Garfield County. We'll get to know the Haskell family much more later on in this story. Mail, however, was just the beginning to the germination of this little ecosystem in central Nebraska. General stores were very important to the general welfare of these budding townships as well, which provided necessary commerce and the exchange of much-needed goods for the hard-working folks in the area. In 1872, several miles east of Ord in the township of Springdale, Dr. Elias S. Harder opened up his general store, the very first in Valley County. In the fall of 1873, W.J. Holliday opened up a general store on his homestead, the first store in what would become the village of North Loop. In fact, one great man who opened up a general store in Ord would be remembered in a very non-general way. More on him and his family later on. If you thought it was rough going to your school, imagine going to class in a sod house built into the side of a hill. In 1874, the first school in Valley County was held in such a dugout. The Mortensen dugout specifically, one of the original Danes to settle in the region. The honor of the very first teacher in Valley County goes to Miss Kate Badgen, who taught her students in this sod dugout just south of Ord, Nebraska. She was the first in a line of many excellent teachers who lived and taught in my hometown. Miss Kate Badgen would eventually become Mrs. W.J. Holliday of the North Loop General Store fame we mentioned above. A literal, real-life marriage of the public and private sectors. Now that's extraordinarily ordinary. As more and more communities and townships were established in the Loop River Valley, it soon required new forms of formal organization so it could continue to support its increasing population. In the spring of 1873, on March 18th, 50 settlers from the Loop River Valley met at George Larkin's dugout near the town of Olean, halfway between Ord and North Loop, and voted to officially organize into a county. At this same election, the location of the county seat was also voted upon. The North Loop settlement made a vigorous but unsuccessful attempt to attain the county seat. Instead, a majority voted for the settlement of Ord to become the county seat. For a time, all was relatively peaceful in the Loop River Valley, as these families struggled to survive and carve out a life for themselves. But since the earliest days of European settlements in Valley County, there had always been tension between the homesteaders and the local Native Americans, although there hadn't been any open hostility between the two groups. That is, until the year 1874, when everything changed for the people of this region, and military intervention would be sent by the federal government to Valley County, Nebraska. On January 18th, 1874, Sioux natives, with supposedly stolen Pawnee horses, passed through the valley, also stealing food, furs, and a cow from the homes of local settlers and trappers. Upon learning about this, a dozen men, led by Charles White, Buckskin Charlie as he was known, pursued the natives early the next morning, determined to recover their property, or fight if they refused. The men found the natives camped at Pebble Creek, about 20 miles northwest of present-day Ord. During the initial confrontation between the two groups, the Sioux refused to surrender anything of value. The natives prepared to resist the settlers, who had fled to the shelter of a stream bank. In the half-hour fight that followed, a man named Marion Littlefield was shot and killed, while 3 natives were killed as well, and several more wounded. This skirmish would be known by history as the Battle of Pebble Creek. As a result of this battle, the settlers formed a committee and petitioned Congress to construct a fort in the upper North Loup Valley for the protection of the region. The original bill called for an appropriation of $50,000 to construct and establish a permanent military outpost near the head of the Loup River Valley. This amount was later increased to $75,000 and later to $110,000, or roughly $2.5 million in today's currency. It was General Edward Ord, then in command of the Department of the Platte, who located and surveyed the site of the fort in the summer of 1874. It was here along Bean Creek, in the north part of Valley County, that construction of Fort Hartsuff commenced on September 1st, 1874. While the fort was being built, Camp Ruggles was established on the North Loup River in April of 1874, which would serve as a base for the military during the outpost construction. This army camp was greatly welcomed by the settlers and homesteaders of Valley County. The 60 men stationed at Camp Ruggles received a minimum of $13 per month, or roughly $300, with regular paydays every 2 months. Rather than silver or gold, the army was paid in paper greenbacks, still unusual to see and use at the time. The Valley locals had their suspicions about this paper money printed off in faraway lands, but at least it brought cold hard cash to the area, stimulating the local economy. The settlers themselves sold a fair share of local goods and commodities from their farms and stores to the army camp soldiers, and even more to the officers' families, and as well as the quartermaster and the commissionary departments. However, it was not until the completion of the permanent fort that a significant economic impact by the military presence was felt by the folks in Valley County. Officially completed and established on September 5, 1874, Fort Hartsuff was named after Major General George L. Hartsuff, a veteran of both the Civil War and Third Seminole Indian War in Florida. All in all, 12 buildings were constructed on the 1,280-acre site, including the post headquarters, soldiers' barracks, officers' quarters, commanding officers' quarters, and a post hospital, all of which surrounded a grassy square with a parade ground in the middle. The buildings were built of lime hauled from Coatesfield, gravel from the North Loup River, and native timber from Jones Canyon, near the town of Burwell in Garfield County. It's worth mentioning, Jones Canyon is a popular booze cruising route for the kids these days, or so I've been told secondhand. These high-quality raw materials made the construction exceptionally solid and sturdy, especially for the time period. The federal government spared no expense on this one. This is one of the key reasons Fort Hartsuff remains so well preserved to this day. Fort Hartsuff soon became the center of social life in the valley, including Christmas and 4th of July celebrations, and other such hootenannies. Through its support of the local economy, the fort helped to offset the effects of drought and grasshopper invasions in the early 1870s and 80s. Overall, though, Fort Hartsuff provided much more economic stimulus than military intervention, which still resulted in a win-win for the folks of Valley County and its county seat of Ord, Nebraska. Although the site that would become the city of Ord had been selected as the county seat in 1873, ground wasn't struck until the following year on the still unnamed town. In May of 1874, Alphonso Robbins, along with Orson and Orville Haskell, the Haskell brothers, purchased the land for the town site of Ord from the Burlington and Missouri River Railroad Company. The town plot was surveyed by the men, and in 1875, the official plat, or town blueprint, was filed. Within the first year of its establishment, a post office was opened up on the farm of A.T. Chin Stacy, who had served as Valley County's deputy county clerk. Stacy was then appointed Ord's very first postmaster. Because of this, for a time Ord was referred to as Chin City, named after Stacy's Chin nickname, who, if I had to guess, had a very strong and masculine jawline. It was during this time period that General Edward Ord, commander of the Military Department of the Platte, made his expedition up the North Loup Valley for the purpose of selecting and establishing a location for the future Fort Hartsuff. The settlers of Valley County decided to name the new county seat Ord in his honor. Valley County was once again buzzing with action and activity, but as always, it was mostly from the fireflies, grasshoppers, and mosquitoes. When asked by his surveying crew at Fort Hartsuff what to name the town that would become my home, General Ord responded, "Name it Scratchtown." Today, you can enjoy a locally brewed beer at Scratchtown Brewery in downtown Ord, Nebraska. Edward Ord was born on October 18, 1818, and played a crucial role as a military general in the Union's defeat of Robert E. Lee and the treasonous Confederacy. In fact, General Ord was present at the very event when Lee and the South officially surrendered, and he is often pictured in paintings of this historical moment. When the surrender ceremony was complete, General Edward Ord purchased the very marble-top table at which Robert E. Lee had sat and surrendered for $40. And so, it was thanks to General Ord that the topic of the defeated and treasonous Confederacy never came up again in American politics. Small-town Nebraska was founded by the many everyday, ordinary folks like you and I, and the listeners tuning into this podcast. Some names we know, some faces we can see, but for better or for worse, many have been lost to the fog of time. And so history is often viewed through big man history by those that made it into the record books. And so we'll be concluding this episode by looking at Valley County's big man, known also as the Father of Ord. Sylvester Smith Haskell was born December 7, 1822, in St. Lawrence County, New York. In 1849, he and his family moved to Illinois and filed a claim under the Homestead Act for a plot of free government stuff. Sylvester was continuously getting news from his children about the not-quite-as-wild Wild West who would travel to the Great Plains ahead of him. In the fall of 1875, Haskell sold his Illinois plot, and he and his wife moved to a property in the Loup River Valley. It was Sylvester's two sons, Orson and Orville Haskell, who had originally purchased the land for the town and surveyed the town plot. A couple of good friends of mine grew up on Haskell Creek Road, named after this family. In the fall of 1876, Sylvester Haskell relocated from his farm to the new budding city of Ord, Nebraska. Not wasting any time at all, he opened up a general merchandise store in the old schoolhouse dugout. Later that year, he completed construction of a brand new building in town, where he moved his goods and opened up Ord's first official general store. He also established a post office in the building, as well as the Ord City Motel. As we learned earlier, his wife ran the mail between Ord and the settlement of Burwell. Sylvester Haskell was very well liked and respected by the growing community around him, and he was known for his generosity and willingness to help his fellow Ordites when times got tough, especially during the droughts and grasshopper infestations of the 1880s and 90s. When Sylvester Haskell was laid to rest at 78 years old on March 1st, 1901, the entire community of Ord mourned the loss of a father and of a friend. All of the businesses were closed that day, and a highly attended public funeral was held, such as had never been known in the history of Valley County. Sylvester Haskell, along with all the folks of Valley County and Ord, Nebraska, are truly extraordinarily ordinary. And it is here where we leave off today's episode. My hometown of Ord has officially been entered into the history books, and its community is beginning to thrive. Businesses, railroads, schools, and new families and immigrants are turning this place from a settlement to a village to a city. Before long, more folks from across the pond, including Germans, Poles, Irish, as well as Czechs, began to migrate to Nebraska and the Great Plains. In the year 1878, my great-great-great-grandfather, Joseph Batoshnik, born February 12, 1853, Czechoslovakia, was one of the first Czech immigrants to move to Valley County, Nebraska, and thus began my family's nearly 150-year-old Valley County story. So please be sure to check out the next episode. Thanks once again for listening to the Human Being Human podcast. I'm your host and creator, Carrington Cooper. Please join me for the next episode, and we'll see each other on the other side. You can follow this podcast on Facebook, Twitter, as well as Patreon. I'll be posting links to all the references mentioned throughout this series, as well as any other cool stories, videos, articles, or other nifty stuff that might be of interest to listeners. Today's episode featured the Bandana Brothers, my former band, and the song Nothing's Wrong, recorded at NECC Studios in Norfolk, Nebraska.
It's in the evening time, the sun sets real slow. I just open up my mind, let the thoughts come and go.
As always, I appreciate all of your ears, and we'll see each other next time.